The foundation of Omnisphere's special sound is its unique and extensive sample library. So in this video, we'll go ahead and review some important sampling basics. To create a playable sampled instrument, many recordings of that instrument being played at different pitches will be taken. These samples are then mapped to a zone or key range that responds to specific MIDI pitches only. In this graphic, 8 separate audio recordings were made. Instead of chromatically recording every single pitch, samples are taken about every 4th or 5th. The sampler tags each zone with something called the root note, which identifies the actual pitch recorded. When notes above or below the root note trigger a particular zone, the sample is transposed to play at the correct pitch. Often, the same pitch will be recorded multiple times at varying degrees of intensity. These samples are then assigned to zones which are mapped to respond to particular ranges of MIDI velocity, rather than to particular key ranges. This allows you to set up your instrument so that the samples of the player playing with the greatest force are triggered by the highest MIDI note velocities. Conversely, samples of the player playing with the least intensity are triggered by the lowest incoming MIDI note velocities. In this example, there are 3 separate velocity zones for each of the separate key ranges. In some cases, velocity zones can be used to help trigger alternate ways of playing an instrument. A common example of this would be to map thumb pops, hammer-ons, string slides, and other techniques to the highest velocity zones on the keyboard. So let's review root note and sample transposition. But here's one thing to keep in mind. When a sample is transposed, all of its resonant characteristics, called formants, are also transposed, changing its character as well as its fundamental pitch. In this example, 3 separate recordings were made of the note F4 being played soft, medium, and hard. The samples were assigned to 3 zones that were given appropriate velocity ranges. In addition, each zone spans a range on the keyboard from E4 to the top of the keyboard. Each of these zones is then assigned the root note F4. When you play the note F4, the correct velocity zone will be triggered, and that sample will play back non-transposed. If you play the note B4, the appropriate velocity zone will still be triggered, but the sample will be transposed up 6 semitones, and the sample will sound at the correct pitch, B4. If played at a velocity of 10, the bottom zone will be triggered and transposed. If played at a velocity of 127, the top zone would be triggered and transposed. In the same way that triggering a sample above its root note causes its pitch to be transposed upwards, triggering that sample below its root note causes the pitch to be transposed downwards. In this video, I'll give you an overview of a couple of different basic types of sound source sets that you'll find in Omnisphere's library. Sample sets are selected from the Soundsources browser found in the Oscillator section when the Sample tab is activated at the top. In the following videos, I'll get into manipulating and modulating sample timbre, sample start, and working with key track on-off. Opening the Soundsources browser reveals a huge library of sound sources. A great many of these are not included in the factory patches or multis. Checking out the source column will give you a good idea of what kinds of objects and instruments were recorded to create these sounds. Everything from household objects to normal instruments struck in unusual ways to vintage synthesizers and more were recorded and sometimes processed in unusual ways. This gives you access to sounds that would be pretty hard to get using any other method. The category column, too, is helpful to look at the many different types of samples that you'll find. Let's first take a look at a specific sample set created by recording multiple vocalists. This group of samples includes recordings of both a male and female singer. The lower right corner of the browser gives us information about the particular sound source. If we click on the Zoom Settings dialog, we can see additional information. Below the descriptive text, we'll see very particular information, including the specs option. Here, the specs option tells us the vocalists were multi-sampled between a range of F#2 and G5. Let's check it out. You can obviously hear that different samples are being triggered as I play up the keyboard. I check out velocity. Regardless of how hard or soft I play, all the sounds have the same timbre quality, although higher velocities do play louder. Separate velocity ranges were not recorded. The changes in amplitude are due to the fact that every amplitude envelope has a built-in velocity sensitivity control. Notes played with a higher velocity expand the amp envelope's effect on volume. So now I'm going to go search for a different type of sample set. I'm looking for something that contains multiple velocity ranges, as well as key mapping. Soundsource zoom tells us that lower velocities trigger an alternate attack, a flourish, instead of a single note. Soundsource zoom gives us lots of useful information about the sound set, and as we've seen, it can be accessed from within the Soundsource browser. We can also access the Soundsource browser directly from the Edit page itself by clicking on the zoom icon right at the top of the oscillator section. So let's audition this new sound source. Keep your eyes on incoming MIDI velocities as they trigger the samples. Three separate styles of playing mapped to three separate velocity ranges. We have a long flourish at low velocities, medium flourish, and no flourish. So this is a sound source with velocity mapping. It's also a pitched sound source that follows the keyboard. This instrument transposes and follows pitch because the key tracking option found here at the bottom of the oscillator section is turned on. This allows non-root note samples to be shifted to the pitches you play. So far we've loaded two types of sound sources, one with just key mapping and one with specialized velocity ranges containing different playing styles. So let's cover one more type of sound source that you can find in the sound source library. First, let me go to my multi-mixer and set part 2 to receive on the same MIDI channel as part 1. Going to part 2, I'll load in a new sound source in the first layer. The Anvil Strike sound source contains a single recording mapped across the entire keyboard and covering all velocity ranges. It's a percussive or one-shot sample. One-shot refers to samples that are allowed to play through their entire natural length without looping through a release stage. The single sample is transposed up or down to greater or lesser degrees, and you can clearly hear the formants shift and the sample's character change. In the next video, I'll cover release stage looping, and we'll explore sample start modulation. Let's go a little deeper into our sampled sound sources and how we can manipulate them and work with them in the oscillator section. In this video, we'll look at altering the static sample start time, as well as playing with sample start fades to help remove clicks. We'll look at modulating sample start with velocity, and we'll also look at release stage looping for sustained sounds. I'll start by loading a sound source that has a very slow natural attack and lasts for a very long time. This sound source is great for pads and ethereal ambiances. The sound source zoom information gives us a hint that this sample is a good candidate for working with sample start modulation. Remember that any sample we trigger is an audio recording. We can start the playback of any recording at its beginning, middle, or end. Let's listen to this sound source with no processing whatsoever. There's my note on. After taking a very long time to reach full volume, the sound sustains indefinitely as long as the note is depressed. The only processing applied to this sound is the velocity sensitivity of the amplitude envelope. Otherwise, the sound sustains at its maximum level. Now watch what happens when I release the note. The sound shuts down immediately. Unlike a one-shot, this type of sample loops a section for playback to enable infinite sustains or long release stages. Let's lengthen the release stage of this amplitude envelope. There's that long, slow, natural attack. Release. That's a 5-second fade out after releasing the note. Altering the amplitude characteristics of any sound is one of the most fundamental ways to change its sound. Now let's jump over to sample start. I'll move the slider in a small amount and play the note. A little more. And more. And more. This allows me to bypass the slow, natural attack of the recording, initiating playback at a later point where there's a sharper, more immediate attack to the sound. Now let me switch the start fade option to no start fade. Listen for the slight click at the start of each note. This can be corrected using one of the start fade options. That's the linear start fade. That was a convex fade. There's the slight click with no fade. And with no delay of sample start, we hear the original sample with its slow, natural build. Let's go back to the anvil strike sample and see how this works out. Check out what happens to samples with very fast percussive attacks. That was with no alteration of sample start. Next, I'll move sample start in a little bit. Softer. And more. Softer yet. As I move sample start later, I move closer to the end of the sample, eventually bypassing the entire recording. So sounds with a slow natural attack can be given a sharper attack by beginning playback where they're already naturally loud. Percussive sounds can be made to sound more muted by bypassing the initial transient. Okay, now check out what happens with this next sound source. I move the slider pretty far in, but the effect is not nearly as drastic as it was before. It's because this sound source contains a large number of samples, and in Omnisphere, this type of sound source has a sample start range of 1 second. Sound sources with 12 or fewer samples have a range of up to 90 seconds. While it's useful enough to manipulate sample start time, we can take further advantage of this and make each note take on its own dynamic characteristic. Here's the anvil strike example again. Sounds with a more percussive attack sound more intense, and the sounds with later start time sound more muted. So let's modulate sample start by velocity to create a more dynamic and playable instrument. We'll right-click on the slider for sample start and select Modulate with Velocity. The thin blue line in the modulation section indicates the range of modulation. If I increase the depth of modulation, the line gets longer, and the higher velocities create an even more muted sound as the sample start is pushed later. But that's not the effect we're looking for. Let's click this Invert button. Notice how the blue line has moved to the left of the target slider, indicating an inverse modulation. The white dot will show the momentary value as I play soft or hard on the keyboard. The harder I strike, the more the momentary value moves to the beginning of the sample, and the more of the percussive attack I can hear. That's the effect we're striving for. Higher velocities, earlier sample start. So let's move the target's initial setting later on into the sample and modulate it earlier by a significant range. Higher velocities move the sample start earlier and earlier, and the highest velocities begin playback at the very beginning of the sample. This can help form the basis for a more dynamic and playable instrument. Hello, let's see what's going on with the timbre controls when working with sampled sound sources. In this video, we'll also look at key tracking in depth. Let's start by turning on timbre crush mode and working with the suspension of belief sound source we used before. Let me move the sample start slider to bypass that very slow attack, and I'll keep the start fade on to avoid the click. Now we'll move the timbre slider in crush mode. I know you hear that, right? You definitely hear that. Wow, that's way different, right? Not really. Now we're getting somewhere. As you can hear, it takes a new note event to hear any changes in the timbre slider's position. The timbre slider in crush mode applies bit crushing distortion to the sound. When moved to the left of center, a low-pass filter is applied to the result. The further you move the slider to the left, the greater the amount of low-pass filtering. Here's our original sound again. Now let's see what happens when we move the slider to the right of center. The same bit-crushing distortion is applied, but this time with a high-pass filter. As I move the slider to the right, there's a greater and greater attenuation of low frequencies. Clip distortion is the same effect that occurs when a signal that's too loud to be encoded by a digital converter is recorded. The loudest samples are all represented by a flat line, and like a pulse wave, this generates the high-frequency distortion. Let's move on from a static change to modulating the timbre. We can only hear changes to the timbre slider when new note events are struck. The randomized source changes the timbre amount randomly for each note played. The white dot jumps around each time I play a new note, indicating a new momentary timbre position. The blue line extends to either side of the initial setting. This indicates that randomize moves the value either above or below this point. Here we can experiment with greater or lesser amounts of randomization with each new note. Lower values result in subtle variations. Higher source values result in more obvious variations. Now we're back to our original sample. Source value is set to 0 and timbre crush is centered. Once you've created a modulation, it can be removed in several ways. Right-click on the timbre slider itself and choose Unmodulate, or in the pull-down from the Modulation section, choose Remove Modulation Routing. Let's switch the timbre section over to the Shift mode. This is a very interesting option. To the key tracking functionality of multi-sampled instruments, where many samples are taken across a variety of key ranges. In fact, this option only works with multi-sampled sound sources. I'll go ahead and load a sound source that contains male and female vocals. Here's a chromatic scale with key tracking engaged. Playing chromatically reveals there are multiple samples, and key tracking ensures that pitch shifting occurs within the same key group. Now here's what timbre shift does. When that slider is moved to the right, the note that you play will actually trigger a sample lower down on the keyboard. With key tracking enabled, that sample will be repitched back up to the note you played. I'll talk about the effect that can have on the sound, but let's look at key tracking. Here, I've turned it off. Here's one sample. Next sample. Next sample. Oh, I've arrived at a sample of a female vocalist. In this register, new samples were recorded on almost every note. How does this interact with timbre shift? I'll move it to the right and play the note F3. This triggers a sample lower down on the keyboard, and in this case, pitch shifting does not occur. There is F3, that is natural pitch. As I move timbre shift further and further to the right, I'll trigger samples lower and lower on the keyboard until eventually the note F3 triggers the male samples mapped lower down. As we can see, if key tracking is disabled, timbre shift has no effect on timbre whatsoever. Here's a chromatic scale. All that's occurring is that MIDI input is being shifted relative to the samples being triggered in the key map. So let's re-enable key tracking and try timbre shift. There's the F3 sample. We hear a lower sample, but pitched up. It sounds like it's getting smaller and smaller. Turns out that the samples we're now triggering have to be pitched up very significantly to achieve the note we're playing. This more extreme transposition means that all of the characteristic resonant frequencies of the tone, the formant regions, are also shifted up. It makes a male sound like a female or a munchkin. Moving timbre to the left, we'll trigger samples to the right and pitch them down more and more drastically. This moves all the resonances or formants down further and further, making the vocalist sound bigger, more like Darth Vader. So that's timbre shift. Think Munchkinization or Darth Vaderization.